I want to talk about the news we received yesterday that we've seen the highest number of arrests of people illegally crossing our border in the history of our country. 1.7 million arrests this year. It is a federal crime to cross the border outside of a port of entry, is it not?
Yes, it's a misdemeanor, that's true.
Well, your job is to prosecute federal crimes. How many of you are actually prosecuted of that 1.7 million?
So the Justice Department doesn't make those arrests? Those are made by Homeland
No, but the Justice Department is responsible for prosecuting them. How many are you prosecuting?
I don't know the answer to that, but they
A lot
have to be
or a little?
referred by the...
Wait a second. You know exactly how many people you're prosecuting from the riot on January 6th, but you can't even give me a ballpark guess of how many people you're prosecuting of the 1.7 million who have illegally crossed our border, committing a federal crime and doing so?
I don't have that number on the top of my head, but I'd be happy to have our staff get back to you.
Do you think that the failure to prosecute illegal border crossings might have something to do with the fact that our border is now being overwhelmed by illegal immigrants who tell reporters they wouldn't have considered making that trip under the Donald Trump administration?
I think there are a substantial number of issues driving migration towards the United States, from the pandemic.
Well, if you ask the migrants, they'll tell you specifically what's driving it. They can do it now. They can get in. Gallup, and not fear prosecution from you. Gallup tells us there are about 42 million people living just in Latin America and the Caribbean who intend to come to the United States if they can, based upon their polling. A lot of people come each year on temporary visas, but then they fail to leave when those visas expire, again, in violation of federal law. Do you believe that those who illegally overstay their visas should respect our laws and return to their home countries?
I think they should respect our laws. It's up to the Department of Homeland Security to make determinations about how we resolve these matters.
And yet the administration is proposing amnesty to most visa overstays who arrived before January of 2021, including those whose visas have yet to expire. So what you're telling us and what you're doing are two very different things. Let me go on. It's unlawful for an employer to knowingly hire an illegal alien. How many prosecutions are you pursuing under this law?
Again, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to have staff try to get back to you.
It shocks me, given the fact that this is now an historic high on illegal border crossings. You're the chief law enforcement officer of our country. You come here before this committee. You devote not a word in your spoken remarks to this issue. You devote, out of a 10-page written statement, one paragraph simply saying we need to expedite the immigration proceedings for asylum claims. I find that astonishing. Let me ask you this. Do you agree that an alien who's received proper notice of his or her immigration court hearing, who fails to appear at that hearing absent exceptional circumstances, and is ordered removed in absentia, should be removed from this country?
I'm not really familiar with exactly the circumstance you're talking about. There are rules about removal, and there are rules that the Department of Homeland Security has established. I'm sorry.
If someone is ordered deported by a court, should they be removed?
If they're ordered deported by a court, then we have an obligation to follow the court's order.
And yet the president, on his opening day in office, instructed Immigration and Customs Enforcement not to conduct such deportations.
I'm not familiar with the specific thing you're talking about. I'm sorry.
Since January 20 of 2021, Border Patrol has encountered more than 1.3 million aliens at the southwest border trying to illegally enter the country. You yourself have acknowledged today that that remains a crime. Have you sent a letter or issued a memorandum to U.S. attorneys directing prosecution of these cases?
No, and the reference of cases comes from the Department of Homeland Security, as I mentioned before.
Your reach is global when it comes to overseas activities such as the bombing that occurred in Kabul. So the killing of 26 August of 13 U.S. troops falls under your jurisdiction, is correct? Or at least the FBI is
well, the FBI can participate. It's likely also DOD, but it's some combination, yes.
Well, the areas of concern, media reports and public and private statements indicate that the bomber was in fact an individual who had been released from the detention center there at Kabul. Can you confirm that?
I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know the answer to that. And
can you respond for the record from, I mean, obviously the FBI does know. It's leaked out enough that I think that it needs to be made official.
to the extent that it would be permissible, and it's not classified information, then of course we'll get back to you, and I'll ask my staff to look into this.
Well, the records of those incarcerated at the detention center were public, and certainly somebody who has blown themselves to bits would enjoy very few residual privacy rights, I would assume.
I don't think it will be a question of privacy rights here.
Okay,
Right.
Just wanted to make sure we had that. The important point, though, is, in my view, is that there are 4,999 or more other individuals who were released, who were free to roam the streets of Kabul on the very days that we were evacuating. I was in Qatar last week, and it was reported to us in unclassified sessions that more than 20% of the individuals who boarded the aircraft in Doha for the United States, more than 20% who came into there, came in with no papers whatsoever. No Afghan papers, no U.S. papers, no other documentations, and that the documentation was produced based on oral testimony. They called it a paper passport, based on the fact that of the 60,000 plus people that passed through Doha, Qatar, 20% of them or more did not have any paperwork. Of the remaining ones, at least 40% had only documentation that it was produced in Afghanistan. How do we know how many, we know some undoubtedly, but how many in fact made the way to the United States? Of the 5,000 plus people who were incarcerated for being ISIS terrorists and the like, how do we know who they are, where they are, and how many of them in the United States, and what are you doing to discover further?
Congressman, you've identified a very serious problem. There was a massive airlift of refugees out of Afghanistan at the very last moment, and that required vetting at not only at Qatar, but also Ramstein and the other bases where people were moved to, and then when they're moved to the United States.
And I don't mean to interrupt you, but in the remaining time, if you could respond for the record about how many you know, how many you've apprehended, how many you're following, because once we know that tens of thousands of people left Afghanistan who had no evidence of a nexus to the United States and were transported to the United States, and knowing that there were 5,000 terrorists that had been recently released, we do have an obligation to figure out what the steps that are being taken to find them and to incarcerate them. And I recognize that there are a number of people in Kosovo who were identified, so we would certainly include that. My last round of questioning really goes to the terrible attacks that occurred at Fort McCoy and other places. We have a significant number of Afghan/American-bound individuals who are currently committing crimes and who have committed crimes. And so I'd like to know, one, to the best of your ability, how many cases you're following, not what the cases specifically are about, and what authorities you've been given or need to be given to deal with these individuals, including revocation of their paroles, which of course is an executive prerogative, but one that we would like to know. Will individuals who have committed crimes have their paroles pulled? And if so, can they then be deported or at least begin the deportation process?
All right, we'll try to get back to you on what we are able to tell you on questions of the crimes that you're talking about.